Indeed. Let's start because many people was kind enough to come to the previous webinar on the Ground Knowledge Transfer Accelerator, and I've been kind enough to, or find the discussion engaging enough to stay for the second seminar, which continues a bit the same thread we discussed early in the morning about beyond GDP and the approaches at worldwide, continental, and the more domestic, local, rural level with insights from the granular project itself. And we're now going to be more practical. We discuss a lot of the theories, the limitations of understanding well-being. But now we're going to go a bit further, and I'm glad to have Carlos and David join me for this second session of today, because we're going to be discussing performance, the performance framework, which we'll cover that in detail later on. But I think the premise of this second session is, this is a new way of, or relatively new way of understanding how EU policies are defined, how they are implemented, and how they're measured and paid. And this is something that's happening right now at this very moment, just a few kilometers down the road from ADL's offices here in Brussels. And there's a lot of interest as well as certain disquiet across Europe about what it means in terms of local development, rural development, and so on. And for that, we decided to have the second session, and we try to be a bit polemic. We'll have also insight from other projects that collaborate with Granular regularly, which I will cover that. So, as I say, the purpose of this session is a timely session, as you can see by the diversity of participants. Is the last of the series of Granular, and we're actually going to use this to better understand, and allow me to be cheesy again, how granular EU policies are, or specifically speaking, how granular this the new performance framework is, because a lot of my colleagues, our colleagues in the Granular projects, been working for 4 years in trying to understand dynamics and problems at very local level, sometimes a square meter level, and perhaps then at Europe, this is not necessarily translated, or yes, we will see it today, into EU policy making. And that's a bit the introduction of the session. I will be just for GDPR reasons. This is a separate session from the previous one. So again, you can exercise your right to not stay and not be recorded if you don't want to be recorded. There will be, of course, a report from the meeting. Again, please mute yourself. Perhaps we'll welcome you can put your camera. And of course, there will be a space for debate, as engaging as hopefully as we had just a few minutes ago. But I will defer on Maite to the introduction of the speakers, and again prevent me speaking too much as always. So Maite, perhaps floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vin, and welcome back, everyone. Welcome to everyone who just joined us, and for everyone who stayed after the first session. So I'm Mervyn Tabouachi. I'm the project manager of Granular from ADL. And as Serafin was saying, we're now going to move to the second webinar of today's bootcamp, focusing on performance indicators in the new MFF and what they mean for the future of rural areas. So to start off, it is my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, so David Boghorst from the European University Institute. So David is a political scientist with extensive expertise in European socioeconomic policies, and he has 2 hats, working both as a policy advisor in the Netherlands and as an academic at the European University Institute in Florence. And his research focuses on EU governments and performance-based financing. And today, David will share some reflections on the new MFF performance frameworks, looking more closely at the NRPP's regulation. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Merve, for that kind introduction. Let me first share my screen, and then let's see. And now I hope that all of you see my PowerPoints. Is that the case?
Yes,
Yes,
please.
thank you.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Well, as the Merveille said, I'm David Bokkers from the EUI. So together with Jonathan Zeitlin, a professor at the University of Amsterdam and also associated with the EUI, for the last couple of years, we've looked at the development of the European semester. So we're governance specialists, not specifically focused on rural areas. So for more specific questions, I'll have to refer you to the other speakers. But we were very interested by the introduction of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. I've written a few pieces about that, and also comparing its governance model to the cohesion policy funds. And then when the new MFF was introduced, we were asked by the European Parliament to also comment on these new proposals. So the presentation I'm going to give is a paper that we did for the European Parliament. You can also find it on the website of the European Parliament, but you should also see my presentation in the context of this political debate that was happening in the European Parliament, where a lot of MEPs are quite negative about the proposal of the NRPPs. So we looked at what governance model and oversight regime for the EU budget after the RF. And let me just put this away so that I can see my slides. We would argue that the National Regional Partnership Plan proposal represents the most far-reaching change to EU budgetary governance since the introduction of the structural funds, so purely in terms of its governance. And the proposed regulation seeks to combine core features of, on the one hand, the cohesion policy funds, but with new innovations that come from the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So on the one hand, it tries to preserve, although not far enough, according to MEPs, the involvement of regional and local authorities vis-à-vis the RF. It also is still based on shared management between Commission and Member States, which is taken from the cohesion policy funds, yet it introduces new elements from the RF, such as integrated national reform and investment plans that seek to leverage the link between reforms and investments. And it has this performance-based disbursement system where disbursement is linked to fulfillment of milestones and targets, which is, of course, taken from the Recovery and Resilience Facility. It's not moving. Yes. So we believe that the governance model and oversight regime of the proposed NRRP regulation is a potentially credible hybrid between the RRF and the CPF with some novel elements. At the same time, a few modifications of the proposal are needed to, on the one hand, ensure fairness and comparability in Commission assessment of national plans, secure meaningful stakeholder participation throughout the policy cycle, and most importantly for this specific audience, we believe that there can be improvements in developing effective monitoring systems that support learning and adaptability without imposing excessive administrative burdens. So the Commission's proposal addressed many of the previous criticisms that have been raised on the RF and the cohesion policy funds, which on the one hand were coming from the European Court of Auditors, which was signaling that there was a lack of auditability. They basically look at it more from a complete contracting kind of perspective, whereas academics were criticizing rigidity and a lack of flexibility in the RF. And you see that the new proposal responds to these two different criticisms by seeking to find a balance, for example, through having, on the one hand, explicit assessment criteria for each milestone and target fulfillment. They assign ex-ante payout values for each milestone and target, unlike with the RF. There are clarified procedures for recovering unjustified payments, even after 5 years after the fulfillment of a milestone or a target. And national and regional stakeholder-based monitoring committees are involved in reviewing plan implementation, but also, and this is important, in the approval of amendments to the operations. At the same time, we see that there are a number of unresolved problems that remain. So there's an absence of a definition of what constitutes addressing all or a significant subset of recommendations to member states under the European semester and other EU policy frameworks. This was something novel introduced in the Recovery and Resilience Facility, but we saw that this criteria was interpreted quite differently across member states, and even in the new proposal, it's still not quite clear what this would mean. At the same time, we may still question the effectiveness of a proposed regional test in ensuring genuine stakeholder participation in drafting, implementing, and monitoring and revising the NRPPs. This is particularly important for the European Parliament debate. In ensuring that monitoring committees have sufficient capacity to oversee national and regional plans effectively, and in ensuring that performance indicators are genuinely useful in monitoring NRPPs in real time without imposing excessive administrative burdens, which is one of the core criticisms that came from the member states in evaluating the Recovery and Resilience Facility. Now, the NRPPs are more flexible than the RRF. And the CPF to some extent. It has a more smooth disbursement system. There is easier plan revision based on reasoned requests without requiring demonstration of changes in objective circumstances, which is the criterion for changing plans under the RRF. Importantly, contrary to the RRF, but in line with the policy funds, there is a mandatory midterm review that lead to the submission of revised plans. And there's a proposal for a new EU facility to support to more rapid responses to crisis and emerging priorities, which is also part of flexibility. At the same time, responding to some of the criticisms from the European Parliament, there's a proposal for an interinstitutional steering mechanism to provide scope for periodic readjustment of policy priorities at both EU and member state level. So this allows for better accountability from the European Parliament. Verifiability and auditability of the NRPPs are strengthened and compared to the RRF through clarified assessment procedures for milestones and targets and transparent ex-ante payout values. At the same time, we consider that this new single audit approach that has been introduced in the proposal creates new challenges that will require national and audit authorities, the Commission and the European Parliament, also to develop expertise in assessing all these detailed performance information alongside traditional cost-based audits. Now, and I think this is really the slide that is most relevant for this particular audience. We would argue when looking at the proposals and looking at the list of performance indicators that this still provides a bit of an unsatisfactory solution for monitoring and assessing implementation of NRPPs. There was already a lot of criticism on the 14 common indicators in the RF, and the new proposals still revert to 500 plus mandatory common indicators that have to be reported on, which are mostly output focused and are still, many of them are a bit weak on evidence of intervention effects. What I mean here, this is still about the number of kilometers of new roads being built, the number of people using facilities, the number of new schools facilities being constructed or renovated, without there being clear links on how that ties to the performance or social outcomes, desirable social outcomes. As an alternative, we propose that monitoring is based more on diagnostic monitoring, which is focused more on process than on output. So it basically requires monitoring commissions to be focused on detecting and correcting problems in real time, and it asks them not to have their projects be based on standardized European common indicators, but to ask each and every monitoring committee to set up themselves program and project specific indicators and to think more qualitatively, so not just quantitatively, but more qualitatively about intervention logics and expected outcomes, so that they themselves can play an active role in the medium-term review and have already have had a discussion on how to correct problems if they emerge, so that they can play an active role also in plan revision. So this is our key relevant proposal for this audience. And then, we argue that to reduce administrative burdens, you should have fewer mandatory common indicators, primarily focusing on the ones where there's a very well-established methodology for measuring results. And the most important one, which is also the most common indicator in the performance framework, will be the avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is about as I said, because this was for the European Parliament, we also have talked about stakeholder inclusion, and the NRPP enhances inclusiveness, we would argue, as compared to the RF through the structural embedding of partnership principle from the cohesion policy funds and the involvement of regional and local actors in plan design, implementation, monitoring, and revision. We believe that inclusiveness could still be enhanced, for example, by requiring member states to publish outline proposals for stakeholder involvement in their plans at each stage of the process. And specifically, accountability of the European Parliament itself could still be strengthened by, or is strengthened by, the provision of quite a lot of information. There is the oversight of national audit authorities by the European Commission. There are still Court of Auditor investigations. There's extensive mandatory national and EU level information on plans and their implementation. And there is the oversight work of monitoring committees with independent stakeholder expertise themselves. Transparency for European Parliament itself could still be further enhanced if the proposal were to include also summaries of monitoring committees' discussions and decisions and reports of annual Commission member state review meetings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David.
Again, the full paper and with details can be found on the website of the European Parliament.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Maybe we can also share that in the chat so everyone can have a look. And thank you very much for setting the scene and highlighting the key challenges and the opportunities of this new performance framework. So following this introduction on the MFF and its performance framework, we are now going to have a look at their implication for rural areas. And for that, I will welcome our next speaker, Serafin Pazos, which you've already seen in the introduction. So Serafin is the senior expert in rural and territorial development at EDEL, and he has over 20 years of experience working on EU policies, cohesion, and also rural development and territorial development. And in EDEL, he's involved in quite a few European projects working on rural and territorial development. And so today in the presentation, he will provide a closer look at how the performance indicators and the performance framework works in practice, and what this means. Serafin,
Thank you, Merve. I'd like to thank David for the presentation, because I know that for some people this sounds like a bit too away from your knowledge. However, I can tell this is rather cutting edge of the discussion where we are. So thank you for provide that general overview on where we are in this debate. I will go to a bit more granular than that. Well, that's the name of the title, but actually I'm not going to talk not only about granular, but actually the research we've been carrying out in a number of policy Horizon Europe projects where we do policy research as ADL, and we have been looking in some of the questions that David said at the very end about how to actually make the performance indicator measure what needs to be measured, more spatially sensitive and so on. Essentially focus on low-hanging fruit. We're not going to be asking here for the moon. We're asking slight changes that can be done within the realities of policy making and the time constraints and the data availability that we believe and we have identified is entirely possible. So now, without further ado, let me see if my computer allows me to do the thing, the PowerPoint. As I say, we're gonna dive into what the new performance framework means for rural areas. And as you see, I will cover not just issues from granular, which Carlos will cover much more detail, but I will basically focus on the input from sister projects or projects related to rural development, local development, that ADL is responsible for developing new policy recommendations. And it's a live project that is happening, a live thing happening right now, precisely with the discussions at the European Parliament and Council on this. So, let's see if my computer allows. Yes. Well, as I say, just a recognition, this is not just me. There's part of my team, apart from Merve, Mike, and others, that being involved in this, and these are the colleagues that, So, as I always say, any good ideas is a collective effort. Any bad ideas, just blame me, as I've been embarking then on this adventure with these various other projects. Just that,
Serafin, you
yes?
are not changing the slide, I think, or at least I cannot see it.
I am.
No, we're still on the first
Yeah.
first slide. Okay, maybe we can share from our side, Maite.
Yeah, wait a moment. It's taking a bit of time, sorry.
It looks like Seraphine is frozen. So as he's not coming back, maybe we can first move to the next session and then we'll come back to this. So I will, Carlos, are you?
Yes, I am here.
Is Carlos is there? Okay, so just slight change of plans. Seraphine, when he's back, he will provide this introduction on the link with the MFF and the performance and the rural areas. But first, maybe we will hear from Carlos Tapia from Nordiregio. So he's a researcher working on territorial inequalities, social vulnerability, and regional resilience. And today he will present some work that was done in the Granular project on rural attractiveness and perceptions, and show how these insights can support more place-based policy making. And he will also introduce the Granular Rural Compass, which was led by our colleagues from the Wageningen University, but who couldn't attend the event today. So Carlos, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mirvael, for the introduction. Actually, in a way, I think it's better to listen to Seraphine's presentation afterwards, because my presentation is going to be more descriptive, I think, on the performance of rural areas from different angles and the diversity as well. But before starting, can you see the screen? Just confirm that the slides are shown.
Are you changing the slides?
No, not yet.
Oh,
yes, but we can see it.
Okay, excellent. Good. So the first part of the talk will be focused on an analysis we've done on the demographic performance of rural areas. If you look at the prevailing narrative on a research and policy level about rural areas across Europe in general, there is a prevailing sort of negative view of how rural areas are performing, which is of course grounded and based on the evidence that different pieces of research are collecting, but at the same time is somewhat negative in terms of generalizing the situation across or for all types of rural areas, not making differences or not looking into the nuances within different types of rural areas, because not all of them can be described as declining in general. There's a lot of diversity within the rural areas. If you look, for example, at how the population at grid level, so 1 square kilometer has evolved over time between the last two census periods, 2011 and 2021, you will see that roughly 16% of the total EU area that can be classified or can be considered as being rural has actually experienced growth. And not only that, but the growth has been faster than the administrative regions where these areas are located, which is what we call here rapid growth rural areas. So based on this sort of evidence, we thought that perhaps it could be interesting to look into the dynamics within those areas that are growing and see what could be the factors that are determining or affecting this degree of attractiveness. However, when it comes to defining what is rural attractiveness or what is making a rural area attractive, the first challenge is defining what we mean by attractiveness. There's no one single definition of how attractiveness can be defined in this context. But in general, the agreement is that it is a multidimensional aspect or a factor that is being affected by different tenants or components. Also, there is different ways of looking at this concept of attractiveness based on who is experiencing that or who is defining it, if it's existing rural populations, newcomers, or even visitors. All this being said, if we move on to the sort of determinants that the literature is actually signaling as being more influential in relation to explaining both attractiveness and demographic performance, the main elements or the main aspects that are highlighted by this literature are those factors that you see on the screen, that have been, of course, grouped in fewer categories, and they are probably much more diverse. But in general, the literature highlights that accessibility to basic services is one of the core elements. Employment and working conditions in rural areas are also a big driver of rural demographic performance, as well as material living conditions and inequalities within these areas is also important, as well as other factors that are more related to social networks and bonds in rural communities, social trust, community bonds, and finally, quality of life and livability associated with this concept of rural idyll that has been also promoted by some scholars and also some policymakers looking at this phenomena. And finally, demographic factors, which are a bit in between, in the sense that they are at the same time a consequence of that hypothetical rural attractiveness or performance, as they are in some cases also factors for attractiveness. And by demographic factors here, I'm talking about essentially compositional elements of rural societies in terms of age, but also in terms of sex ratios, etc. So with all these elements in mind, what we have tried is to essentially model this information using a combination of methods. We focused on rural cells in the population grid across 30 European countries, modeling rapid population growth as a dichotomous outcome, so rapid growth versus decline or stagnation for each rural cell. And it is the definition of what is rapid growth, what is attractive, has been consistent and based on the definition they gave earlier. So a cell is considered to be experiencing rapid growth. It has experienced population growth between these two census periods, and also it has grown quicker, faster than the administrative regions where they are included. And this includes not only the region, but also the national level. We used 20 explanatory factors or variables for this that could be giving us clues or signals of what could be influencing this performance. And we also wanted to understand this, thinking about not just yes or no, but more like a picture, an overview of which of these factors could be affecting the odds of a cell being classified as experiencing rapid growth. We had two experimental designs, one cross-section for grid cells, for all grid cells, and one panel design with time series for populated cells only. So populated cells in this case means cells that were already populated in 2011. And we also used different model families to consider the differences in behavior within natural grouping factors or clusters. So for example, we know that different administrative regions and degrees of urbanization affect the performance or the behavior of individual cells. So we considered that in the analysis by fitting a series of mixed effects models. We also ran a series of comparisons and robustness checks to assure the accuracy of the results or the robustness of the results. And this plot is essentially summarizing the findings or the results. So essentially, the plot shows the logistic regression coefficients expressed as odds ratios for the most comprehensive mixed effects model for populated cells only. So this focuses only on cells that were already populated in 2011, and we look into how those cells evolved over time to avoid potential discrepancies in the methodological choices between these two census designs. So the further the points are from the vertical line that crosses at odds 1, the stronger the effect of the predictor on the outcome. If, say, predictor X has an odds ratio that is twice another one, it doubles the likelihood of this cell being classified as rapid growth as compared to a situation where that factor is absent. However, it is important to keep in mind that these odds are not informing or representing causality, but rather association or strength of association between these factors and the outcome being rapid growth. The error bars are also shown that indicate essentially if these are statistically significant or not. So if the error bars are not crossing the vertical line over value 1, it means that the odds for that specific predictor are unlikely to be accidental. So now, when it comes to the actual results, we will start with the most challenging ones to interpret, which are demography and environmental factors. Demography are difficult to interpret because of the reason that I mentioned earlier. It is not clear to the extent to which, for example, sex ratios or median ages are actually affecting the outcome of a cell being classified as being in rapid growth, or actually the consequence, so that when a given area attracts population, then the sex ratios and the median age modifies. But in general, what we see is that both of them, higher proportion of men over female and higher median age, are negatively associated with the outcome, with the probability of experiencing rapid growth. The environmental factors are a bit more difficult to interpret because we see that they can go on different directions. So, for example, you see that the association with extreme hot days, and the outcome is negative, whereas the association between frost days and the outcome is positive. We also see that Hammurabi index that shows the intactness of the area, so environmental quality, biodiversity preservation is positively associated, but then we see that scenic beauty, which is an indicator we have produced in the period, is negatively associated. So there's no clear pattern with these livability factors. The only exception is cultural heritage, which is here captured through UNESCO sites, proximity of UNESCO sites that is strongly and systematically positively associated with the outcome, meaning that whenever there's a presence of UNESCO sites or rich cultural heritage, the likelihood that an area is experiencing rapid growth is higher as compared to other factors. When it comes to accessibility, the picture is much more clear. These factors are essentially showing the time that is required to reach the nearest town of over 5,000 inhabitants, city of 10,000, and cities of 50,000 inhabitants. And there is a clear and strong signal that accessibility to these cities, so to public services, is very important, and increases with the size of the city. So there's a gradient. The factor, the coefficient, the odds ratio in this case is stronger with when there is more people living on this nuclei. This is confirmed further by the elevation, which is also very strongly and negatively correlated or associated with the outcome. Labor markets, there's less clear, obvious pattern, and it's also very weak effect. So we don't find strong evidence supporting this notion that labor markets actually determine or affect the probability or the likelihood of rural areas to experience population growth. However, we see that compositional elements, economic structural elements related to the specialization of local economies, for example, employment in high-tech sectors and economic diversification, are positively associated with the outcome, as well as other material living conditions, in particular housing prices, which is very strongly associated with and positively associated with the likelihood of experiencing rapid growth. Again, it makes sense if you think about rural areas experiencing or attracting new inhabitants resulting in higher housing prices, and also income is positively associated. The same goes for this indicator by Eurostat years lost by non-natural causes or premature deaths, which is negatively associated as it could be expected. And finally, with social trust indicators, there's a mixed picture. Perceived corruption seems to be more negatively associated and is more significant compared to social trust. So this was a comprehensive result from the analysis. Now, the challenge or the aspect that I want to highlight is that this picture is not systematically consistent when we change the model setting. So very quickly, this is just a comparison of the results of the model I was describing earlier, which is the most robust model with populated cells and the change over time, with the same model on a different sample that includes all cells, not only those that were populated in 2011. And here you can see different behaviors. In some cases, the outcome is pretty consistent, so no big changes. In other instances, you see that the effect attenuates. For example, if you look at some of the environmental variables, the effect of those are attenuated when you consider all cells and not only that were populated. Reversely, you see situations where the effect is further incremented. So, for example, elevation is even more important factor to consider when you look at all cells, so all areas, and not only that were populated. So, for example, thinking about new settlements in places that were not populated before. And you see also instances where the directionality changes, which can be explained in different ways. But I wanted to highlight a different aspect here, which is this situation when there's a structural relation, the one we saw earlier on accessibility, and then we see that this can change. So that in this case, for example, when you consider all the cells in the sample, what happens is that it is not anymore, the effect is not anymore growing with the size of the agglomeration to which each cell is accessible, but rather goes in the opposite direction, so that the effect attenuates with the size of the agglomeration. Again, this makes sense if you think about remote areas with limited accessibility to big cities, where accessibility to services is determined by smaller nuclei, smaller towns. And there, those smaller towns, proximity, accessibility to those smaller towns is having a greater effect or greater influence on the outcome. So all this to say, territorial conditions matter, and policies should be informed by this diversity in order to be able to capture the complexities, the intrinsic complexities of rural areas. So how are we trying to capture that complexity in granular? It essentially involves two big tasks. The first one is through the traditional use of territorial typologies. We started this process with a compilation of rural typologies that was already presented 2 years ago. You can download this report with this overview of rural typologies across Europe or territorial typologies across Europe from the website of the project. And that was the starting point where we identified a series of factors, elements, needs, and peculiarities of these typologies to build on in order to create our own typology. And the decision regarding how this typology should be created is that essentially we foresee or we planned to use this typology created in the project as an analytical tool for research purposes that still was aligned with policy priorities. That's why we decided to build on the existing degree of urbanization typology and try to add nuance to that basic classification. We also thought that we also wanted to provide a richer understanding of rural areas and support policy and planning with this typology by focusing only on rural, so non-urban areas across Europe. The typology is multidimensional, so that we wanted to incorporate different indicators and perspectives on the typology, and we decided to work on the grid level rather than administrative level, and also aiming at staying as relevant as possible over time by working on a transparent way, reproducible workflow, etc. So the topology, which will be launched or presented by the end of May, roughly, includes the indicators that you see here. We are adding demography layer on top of the existing layer, that is degree of urbanization, which is only based on population density. We are incorporating also population change. We are including also elements related to built environment, building volume. We are including also topography, elevation, landscape modification through this Hammerby index that I mentioned before, and also accessibility, so travel time indicators. The results will be presented soon, and within this new topology or this incremental topology in relation to DKIRBA can provide better nuance for this. So maybe, I don't know if I should continue, Merveille,
Yes,
without...
thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Carlos. I think Serafin is back in the room, so he can go ahead with his presentation, Serafin, and then we will welcome Carlos again.
Well, let's see if the gods of internet is not basically blocking my screen for the third time today. Maybe they're telling me something about me speaking too much. Thank you, Carlos, for stepping in. And just for out of precaution, I will not be mishandling my slides. The Carlos intervention was timed and put in the agenda to answer the question that I was putting here, which is how granular is the performance framework of view, which is the main tool, as David mentioned, that will orient how expenditure is going to be, how 2 trillion euros are going to be spent over the last, certainly 800 billion euros of the money the central member state, the National Regional Partnership Plan, is going to spend over 8 years. And as David mentioned as well, it's a big revolutionary change. So of course, the answer, of course, the question is not how granular the project, the performance framework is, but not enough. And therefore, the idea was magically to hand over to Carlos and say, look, many other things that can actually be done without much trouble. But without getting into that yet, because I believe Carlos will join us for a second go, as I believe Bettina couldn't make it in the end today. Let me provide some input from these other projects we've been working on. So could we move a couple of slides, please? We can start. The next one. Yeah, there. So what is this performance framework? This performance framework, as David mentioned, is the first single tool where all EU funds sent to member states to this National Regional Partnership Plan is going to be measured. This is the new logic. It's payment by results, and therefore you need to measure properly what you are spending the money on in order to evaluate results, and that will have an impact on member states getting paid. And member states are supposed to reach a number of milestones to achieve that. So how do you define the baseline? How do you find the milestone? How do you find the scale? Is quite important. Second element, and that's like the performance framework comes from the Next Generation EU, the Recovery Fund, that has been in itself a big revolutionary change here in the way EU policies are designed and implemented and funded, is the fact that the national plans will capture all the funds that at the moment were like about 20 funds that member states implement, essentially cohesion policy and agriculture, common agricultural policy, but many others as well. And they are going to be put in a single envelope in a single plan. So as Laura mentioned earlier, we have a chance to avoid the classic silos that bureaucratic policies, ministerial policies, multi-level politics require. As some colleagues mentioned the other day, it's a great opportunity if the opportunity sees. Let's see if it does, because of course, trying to bring together so many ministries horizontally, so many national and regional administrations when they are relevant and they are competent, that is a challenge in itself. It's not been done in this scale, not even in the Recovery and Resilience Facility. The problem with this plan, this national envelope, is that its default position is centralized, and that can create a lot of problems in terms of competence and in terms of territorial intelligence. But looking for the perspective of granular and rural development, This more holistic approach can enable multi-fund synergies, collaborative interventions, functional area approaches, and that's something opportunity that. Next slide, please. But as I say, many people will focus on the big, how much money is getting for rural areas, how much is getting for cities or for environment and climate. And very few people, comparatively less people, focus on this other piece of legislation that is attached to this EU Funds 2018-2034, which is the performance framework, and particularly the annex of the performance framework. I mean, this is bureaucratic politics at best, but actually this thing I'm going to show you now will have a disproportionate effect, much more than in the past, about how money is spent and how it is targeted. Next slide, please. So essentially, what the Commission is proposed last July is a new single performance framework. So all interventions financed by the EU will respond to the same template, will respond to the same annexes, the same indicators. So there's less variability and less artificial silos per policies. It aims to discover what is measured, what are the results, what are the outputs, but also what are the outcomes. And outcomes-based policies, as we discussed earlier in the United Nations context earlier today in the morning, is not an easy thing to do. It has a great advantage because it can reduce administrative burden because it's payment by results, potentially introduce simpler ways of delivery, and also having a single platform, they call the single gateway, that will essentially tell you how much money is spent and in this particular local area. This is something that is quite important because, for instance, in the current period, we got something called the cohesion open data that can tell you in a certain level of granularity how much money is spent in regional development, in social inclusion, and so on. But it doesn't include how much money and what is spent and where on rural development. This is something that happened like up until 2021, but in the current programming period, for reasons that is too long to explain here, that's no longer the case. So many people ask me, okay, can you know how much money is spent in my area and so on? That many people contact me with things like that. I say, well, actually, I just point you to this open data thing. You can find it yourself. But then ask me, but in rural areas, what? Actually, I cannot tell you because it was possible in the past and not possible now. Hopefully, with this new single gateway, we will actually be able to see every penny invested from the European Union in a country and where it's actually spent, what for, and which state of expenditure that is. No, that's what it says in the deal. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, yeah. As I say, it's the performance framework. It introduced this common framework, this single gateway. It also has a number of horizontal priorities, for instance, climate and gender. And that's actually quite good because they're able to focus on place-based development and look at the different functions and the different interventions from the EU and complemented by national measures in that. It's also linked to the European semester, so it's linked to the structural reforms that member states every year commit to uphold. It's like eternal love, and then every year they fail to deliver. So linking structural reforms to payments and to the achieving of milestones is a good idea. As a colleague said earlier, it's done right. Next slide, sorry. And now is the skeptical in me. As I say, take it in as a personal comment, back with some of the research we have mentioned, or I mentioned from other projects, but just take it from me. I would say that we run the risk, the current performance framework, of being insufficient, as David mentioned. And I could say even more, knowing the dynamics in some countries, we can actually have the deterritorialization of EU policies, because there is the expenditure tracking for urban and rural area. It is included, but in a very general way. For instance, now there's a proposal that 10% of EU, of this National Renewable Partnership Plan is spent in rural areas, but it's not defined where rural is. And that is quite contrast because the EU, as mentioned earlier, led the world in the definition what it is an urban area, what it is a city, what it's a rural area, or even in functional areas. There's actually legislation on that. It's not just a policy academic thing. There's a regulation, EU 2017-391, which is what ideally should be used to track EU funding, because that way you can actually know what happens and where it is spent. Purely hypothetical personal opinion assessment. With the current framework, unless there is some legal thing that we managed over the last few months to track that I'm unable to track, but it's not obvious that money can be actually properly tracked in urban rural areas. So you could actually have a scenario where, hypothetical, that NAS3 level, which is a province, and you say, well, the EU has spent X amount of money in this province, this county, this department. But actually, if the way the performance framework is defined, you could result that, yes, the money has been spent in that province, but in a city. No, it's fine, like cities. You can move to the next one. Because, NAS3 is a province, but, you put the money in suburbs of a city, the capital city of the headquarters of that province, that will still count as rural investment, because if that province has been determined as being predominantly rural, that's rural investment. This is screenshots of the territoriality of the performance framework. As you can see, it's very, very general. Member states are only required to track urban areas, not defined, rural areas, not defined, autonomous regions. And then they are supposed to track investment for the local development in a very crude way. So number of local action groups, number of initiatives spent, number of beneficiaries. This is output investment, is not outcome investment. And it is true, comparatively speaking, you go anywhere in the world, many countries and regions have tried outcome-based policies and outcome-based budgeting. Is super difficult to do. The attributability of investment to outcome, when outcomes are societal outcomes like reducing climate change, linking that to a particular piece of investment is always super difficult. And so the EU is not an exception on that, but perhaps this could be a bit more sophisticated than it is at the moment, because the territoriality is very vague or approximative, to say the least. Personal opinion. Next slide, please. And as I say, the EU has actually very robust methodologies, and not talking about Carlos' very sophisticated methodologies, but at least should include something like this. This is Eurostat data that actually tells you what is urban and rural, and tracking of expenditure should actually follow at the very least this, no more. Next slide. If not more, is the functional area approaches. It is true that the proposals mention functional areas. The EU has done a lot of work on that. JRC has done a lot of work on that. Granular and Rustic have done a lot of work on that. But this is not properly reflected, or even reflected at all, in the policy design that the Commission has presented. It can still be added as secondary legislation and guidance, but to be fair, if you want to look at the text, you don't see that. And that's a missed opportunity, because you don't have to make the optimal the enemy of what is possible. But at least we should actually reach to what is possible and have that frame in EU legislation to ensure a consistent approach, minimum consistent approach across the EU. Next slide. So, as I say, this is just from a separate seminar we did in the morning or in the Monday on sustainability in agriculture. But I kept it here because it's quite clear. As I say, the focus is on outputs and not outcomes. If you look about generation of rural farmers, it could be a generation of rural businesses. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be a similar thing. It's just number of farmers supported, number of cooperation projects, number of new young farmers, number of hectares subsidized, and so on. That is low-hanging fruit. This is the sort of policy making I've been doing for decades. And perhaps the challenges of Europe and the need for the European budget to be responsive to citizens' need should perhaps be slightly more sophisticated. Next slide. So now we come to a number of proposals that we have been developing through a number of projects, in this case, beetles and grass sealing. That's why agriculture, climate, and gender is lumped in a single slide, because actually this project were paid by the Commission to actually look at gender in agricultural rural areas. So that's why, and sustainability, gender in agriculture in rural areas. So that's why we lump them together for that reason. And we have found that there's a lot of indicators that are available, comparable at the European level, that could actually be introduced to disaggregate climate impacts and also gender related impacts. So again, I think the key thing is not to ask the Commission or the Member States to create new data if there's no data available, or create new methodologies, too complicated, but actually at least use the portfolio of data and indicators that we have. And we have identified at least 20 or so that could actually easily add it to the current performance framework and will make it more spatially sensitive, sectoral sensitive, sustainability sensitive, and gender sensitive. And that's something that a low-level hanging fruit that, if done through amending the current proposal by the legislator, or perhaps at member state level by introducing additional criteria in their national regional partnership plans, could actually have a disproportionate effect to make rural areas in investment in agriculture more sustainable, more equal. Next slide. That is, again, other things that, to our surprise, that are in the EU framework, and they are not actually translated into performance. One thing is this issue that David mentioned earlier about multi-level governance, the regional check, how to ensure that the competent authorities, the civil society stakeholders, are actually participating in the design and implementation of these new funds. There is something called the European Code of Conduct Practice, Code of Conduct Partnership, which is like a general EU guideline. It's a EU decision. It has a legal backing. But because it's not translated into specific performance indicators, essentially member states can interpret the way they want. So the only thing we are suggesting is very surgical changes to the performance framework to make sure that we can actually have a measure of inclusiveness, a measure of participation. Something not too sophisticated, but at least point out the way to member states that you cannot do multi-level governance and participation in a creative interpretation. There is EU public money being invested here, and you spend a minimum level of accountability that is comparable, more or less comparable, minimum comparable with other member states. And that has to be reported through the single gateway. Next slide, please. And yes, I promise I'm finishing. But just a couple of more examples. On transport, again, we have a lot of classic indicators about number of roads, number of electric vehicles supported, and not about user-centered needs and values, spatial distinctions. And that's quite telling, because the EU, the European Commission, since last May, has a definition, for instance, transport poverty, which is for rural areas. And I would expect this is linked to something called the Social Climate Fund, which is a separate fund, not covered by today's discussion. And I would expect reasonably that this definition were included in the performance framework, actually in order to encourage member states to define transport poverty in their context and invest money in transport poverty when money is available for that. To our surprise, at least we cannot see it. If this is some random annex that is lost in somewhere, we don't know. But definitely we'll be keen to consider that, to precisely introduce incentives of behavior change and incentives for geographical inclusion. Next slide, and I think it's a couple of them more. Same for housing. There is discussions about rural housing. There's discussions about there's priorities for investing in rural housing, connected to the housing action plan that was tabled last December. But there are basic metrics that are not too difficult to collect at least regional level, if not through provincial, sub-regional level, on affordability, accessibility, environmental quality, housing stability, homelessness. These are things that are actually available and that should be, in our view, introduced to the performance framework to have a common framework across the EU. Next slide, and I think is the same with access to essential services. This is connected to the issue of right to stay. This is a topic that's going to be a public consultation in a couple of weeks, I think. There's a lot of methodologies developed about to find right to stay in access to essential services to ensure enabling conditions for people to choose where they want to live. Some of that is already available. There's methodologies from Granular, from Rustic, from ESPON Prophecy. This excellent study was tabled last year. The DG Employment study report on access to essential services. So there's already a conceptual architecture that could actually incorporate the performance framework, not like the whole detail, but at least some elements of that to actually provide some guidance to member states about how to articulate right to stay, this new principle from the letter report, into the National Regional Partnership Plan, which is one of the leitmotifs of the Commission's proposal. Last slide, I think. Same with digital inclusion. This is come from the Codex project. Again, there are low-hanging fruits there that we believe, without much effort, it could be done. Next slide, please. I'm taking too long. So just to summarize, there are a number of things that ideally could be done and other things that can be done. What we believe is that the current proposal makes it perhaps too easy to meet. I mean, member states will say discuss otherwise. I understand that, but there could be small improvements in the current performance framework that will actually define the problem better, especially target the problem better, disaggregate by gender or sector better than it is at the moment, with data that is already collected, that will have a disproportionate effect both in outcomes, but also in terms of ensuring that the money is spent where the money should be going. And I'll leave it there. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Serafin. So now I will give the floor again to Carlos, who will be presenting on behalf of our colleagues from Wageningen University who couldn't attend the event today. And he will present the work done on the Granular Rural Compass. Please, Carlos.
Yes, thank you, Merve, and thank you also, Serafin, for that really interesting presentation. So essentially, what we have been doing in the Granular project in terms of analyzing diversity within rural areas had two main dimensions or core principles. One was more looking at structural elements, so that is the work that I presented earlier about the mostly the typology. But another perspective is more functional, as also Serafin mentioned. There is a growing interest by the European Commission and other stakeholders to increasingly adopt a functional perspective in differentiating rural areas. And this is what our colleagues Henk Oostende and Bettina Bock have been doing in Granular, mostly at the beginning of the project, trying to explore this diversity from that functional perspective. And they created a very nice conceptual framework that is called Rural Diversity Compass that I will try to sort of present on their behalf. So the point of departure for this framework is that, as Serafin was already saying earlier, rural areas serve diverse and multiple functions, where the balance between those functions is essentially place-specific. It's influenced by relations with other areas, and it's also dynamic as it evolves over time. So with this in mind, the Rural Compass essentially aims to explain the ongoing appreciation of rural areas from this functional perspective, being place-specific and sort of sensitive to policy changes and opportunities. In particular, it has the aim of supporting rural proofing in a policy context. So this is how the Rural Diversity Compass is structured. Essentially, it has four main functional or functionalities embedded in the notion: recreational, residential, environmental, and unproductive. I will go through them individually very quickly just in a second. And then it also has four different tenets of justice: spatial, climate, social, and resilience perspectives that are somehow embedded and connected to all of these functionalities in different ways. They are placed where they are, but it's not that spatial justice is only relevant for productive functionalities. It's just rather a design outcome. Each of these functionalities, and we will now start with the first one, is essentially underpinned by two groups of factors. One is more structural, more related to the characteristics of rural areas, and the other one is more related to the performance of rural areas. So starting with this first functionality, residential, it includes dimensions that are relevant for both rural residents and communities, and includes, as I said earlier, some structural elements, infrastructures, in this case, services, housing, digitalization, digital services, but also compositional, in this case, aspects, demography, migration, mobility, cohesion, and well-being that somehow summarize the performance of rural areas from this perspective. The second functionality, which is productive functionality, it also embeds two elements, one structural element that includes economic structure, sectors, labor, employment, labor markets, etc., but also the performance of those over time in terms of GDP or productivity metrics, but also innovation. The third functionality, environmental functionality, combines the capitals perspective with natural capitals, but also levels of circularity, renewable energy production, etc., with a more performance-related perspective where climate change, ecosystem services, and circularity elements are also included. And finally, recreational functionality that combines, again, infrastructures for leisure and tourism, amenities, cultural heritage, attractions, and also performance-related elements like seasonality, second-home residence, multi-locality, etc. So what we thought, or what our colleagues thought it would be more relevant for rural governance and rural proofing from this framework, or building on this framework, is that the iteration of functionalities in time lead to place-specific challenges and opportunities. So, for example, rural housing is very significant in rural areas, but it's also signaling, in some cases, a weakness in residential functionality. So these elements are those that allow to provide a better understanding of these dynamics in a policy framework and with a policy perspective. So at the same time, these relations need to be, so the functionals need to be understood in connection with other functionalities. So for example, defines why, in this case, the example that I was mentioning earlier, defines why housing is needed for whom and which potential solutions could be found to tackle that housing challenge, so that it becomes relevant for rural proofing in solving local challenges. But these definitions of the applicability of this framework on the local level, of course, is highly context specific and requires involvement of local actors in the application of the framework. So perhaps the main takeaway in this context related to this framework is that diversity of functionality dynamics supports governance for justice and resilience in a broad way, but it needs to be anchored to local processes, and it needs to be applied by local actors themselves. So if you want to know more about this framework, I just added this slide here, which is the slide where you can again link to this report with this Rural Diversity Compass was presented more comprehensively, and also feel free to reach out to the two colleagues in the project that were in charge of this work, Henk Oostendi and Bettina Bock from Wageningen University, and they will be glad to answer to your inquiries. And just one final slide from my side, trying to combine these two presentations that I was sort of delivering today. Just a few key messages. First of all, rural diversity shapes demographic performance, and demographic here on the last version, which obviously I did not send to Merveille, was in parentheses because it's not only demographic, but it's mostly demographic based on the evidence I was providing today. So that this diversity shapes performance and vice versa. The performance also shapes diversity in various ways. The rural diversity can be characterized in different ways and from different angles. No standpoint is intrinsically better. Here in rural today, in particular, we are mostly looking at these two elements: structural change perspective with the new rural topology we are trying to build, but also this functional perspective with the rural compass. In both cases, this diversity is key for policy effectiveness. Policies should be informed by this diversity, otherwise they are likely to fail because there's a huge set of situations, contexts, knowledge that need to be built upon in order to make these policies more effective. So that would be my final takeaway. And with this, I thank you for the attention. I'm really happy to continue the discussion now.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for these great presentations. So without further ado, I will give the floor to my colleague Maria Alonso Roldan, who is an expert in rural and territorial development at ADOL, and she will be leading the discussion and the Q&A with the speakers. Please, Maria.
Thank you very much, Merveille, and thanks especially to David, Carlos, and Serafin. You gave very clear ideas about today's motto, which is collecting data with a purpose, which, coupled with this meaningful engagement processes at local level, could be the key to advancing rural well-being. And I'm going to just take the opportunity while David is still with us to ask him about this diagnostic monitoring that you mentioned as an alternative, and how would this work in practice with monitoring committees? What would it change compared to the current system? I know you need to dash, so by all means, if you can only take at least one question, it will be great. Thanks.
Thanks so much. So as I mentioned, it is based on intervention logic. It is the idea that you want to, you want to not necessarily focus so much on reporting on output so that the EU could sort of showcase what is the collective output of all the projects, the number of kilometers built, etc. But it is to create ownership at local level of projected impacts. So you would ask for each project, the monitoring committees themselves, or to design, program, and project-specific indicators and logics of intervention. It is basically based also on practices that are already established in member states themselves. For example, in the Netherlands, there is, where I'm from, there is a law called the Comptabiliteitswet, so the accounting law, which already demands for each new large project or law that ex ante project and project-specific indicators are set up, which are not just quantitative, but also are based on an intervention logic, on processes. So it ex ante defines how it will be evaluated, what will be done in terms of follow-up, etc. And if you want to, so currently under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is sort of a more centralized mechanism, you saw that changes to plans were mostly based on the interaction between member states and the European Commission. And here you want to have more of a bottom-up logic to plan modifications where there are experts involved, ideally where there's also external scrutiny involved. So it's a way to create ownership of the plan itself and sort of focus on real-time monitoring of issues rather than collective communication on output.
Thanks, David. I'm going to connect a quick question to Serafin before I take one from the public to Carlos. Serafin, you mentioned a few proposals, very clear ideas, and then those who are working in EU-funded projects could actually take good note of those. But if you could change just one element of the EU performance framework to better reflect the rural realities, which one would you pick?
Without a doubt, to introduce the tercet classification right front and center in the main regulation and the performance framework regulation. I got colleagues who are telling us that no, it's somewhere reflected. I don't see it. The problem is if I don't see it, and we spent a fair amount the last 6 months looking at this in very granular detail, the problem means that managing authorities will also miss it. So if the tercet classification, what it is an urban rural area, which is a worldwide classification led from Europe, is not in our proposal, not clear in our proposal, let's make it clear in the proposal, in the legislation, in the annex, because otherwise it's going to be lost. I mean, I'm still trying to find where that is because I don't see it. And as I don't see it, many others who will be, at national level, regional level, will not be. Thank you.
Thanks, Serafin. Carlos, there was one question from you in relation to if you could elaborate a bit further on the findings and potential implications across Europe, particularly regarding trends and regional tendencies in Eastern, Western, and or Mediterranean Europe. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for this question. I mean, it's really a relevant question, a critical question, but also very difficult, very challenging to be answered in this context. But maybe the easiest way to deal with it would be to just look again at this map. So essentially, as a reminder for those who were not maybe present when it was shown, the map shows a classification of regions in terms of based on their demographic behavior between the two last census periods, 2011 and 2021. Cells in green colors are those where growth has happened and has happened faster than the regions where they are included. And if you look at the patterns across different regions, you will quickly get an impression of what is the sort of the patterns that can be found in different areas. So for example, you look at Poland, you quickly see that there mostly growth happens in peri-urban areas surrounding the bigger cities. But if you then move to Scandinavian countries, Ireland, or even Spain, you see that the patterns are very different, are more dispersed, not necessarily close to cities. So these patterns clearly lead to different behavior, to different implications for policy design. And this is, again, the message that I would like to emphasize today. That it's very important to look at the specificities. And it's very difficult to make generalizations now, eastern, northern, southern, etc., because the differences go a bit beyond that. With our models, we try to capture all this diversity in a nutshell, so that the findings that I presented earlier were already sort of filtering, controlling for this diversity, but still it is important to do a much more sort of tailored analysis.
Thanks, Carlos. Looking at this connection between what data is being collected and how we are defining policies, maybe I'll ask one final question that Serafin can start, and maybe then Carlos and David is still there. What do you think would be the ideal pipeline from data to local evidence to actually policy decisions? What would be the ideal pipeline?
Well, if I start, I definitely, and that's great that you made the question to David about this new way of understanding the role of monitoring committees and the analysis. I think that's something that should be developed further, because, like it or not, the EU policy is like it's like a big machine. One starts, I mean, there's even people who still fight in the very notion of national regional partnership plans. I mean, personally, I think that's, once there's dynamics are in motion, it's very difficult to come back to fundamental rethink. That is, so we need to do what we can now. And definitely, if monitoring committees were more empowered to actually provide a more participatory approach, more the knowledge analysis to try to actually understand their own logic, but with a pan-European framework, because otherwise we end up having different methodologies across the way, but at least some minimum guidelines. That doesn't have to be in the main regulations. Could be through what we call in cohesion policy of notes, like implementing notes, provided they are agreed by member states and the Commission, and it's a minimum criteria. I think it's a good way forward. I have a meeting right after that about the partnership principle at regulatory level, but actually we should actually look more into the partnership principle through this diagnosis methodology at local level. And I'm sure that AUE and others in the coming months hopefully will contribute to that debate, and that's something we'll look forward to hear, and to a certain extent, if we can, also to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. In your case, as data analyst, what would be the ideal pipeline? So how could you transfer this to policymaking?
Well, maybe what I could do is just try to illustrate this by an example. 20 years ago, I was working in the Italian Ministry of Development. At that time, that's how it was called. And I was asked by one of the Secretary of State, I think it was, to prepare a few visuals, maps to show the degree of investment that that government has actually managed to transfer from European funding to the region of Sicily. And because this person came from Sicily originally, and he was very proud to show how the budget, the total amount was invested, was like increasing by a huge amount. However, the outcome indicators in the region didn't improve at all during that time. But that was not the main concern of this person. He was mostly interested in how much money he managed to transfer from Europe to Sicily. So I think accountability and performance is what really matters here. Not so much how much funding, but how this funding is transformed into something like beneficial for the region.
Which is very well connected to what we were discussing in relation to outcomes or outputs, and this giving more power to the monitoring committees. And maybe David, if you're still with us, which I can see you are, thank you very much. What do you think would be this ideal pipeline? How could you receive this data and then transfer it into more actionable policies?
It's a very complicated question. I think let me sketch a little bit of a timeline. Let me close the door here because there's... you had the cohesion policy funds, which, and to put it very simplistically, it was, payment based on receipts. I'm simplifying a lot. And even people from the Commission themselves admitted that this mechanism had a big reputational problem because it was local projects where the link between the local projects and large EU transitions was not clear enough. Then we did a new experiment, which was the RRF, which is more centralized, and there was the idea we need to have more clarity on what do we get for our money. But then when you try to put politics, etc., into a contract, then what you get is that, and especially if you are dispersed on the basis of output, it can only be output that is under your control. So it cannot be performance, because performance is linked to many issues that are not under your control. And even if you link it to output, there is a risk, and that's immediately what happened, is that it becomes excessively bureaucratic because it needs to be detailed if it's verifiable. So on the one hand, what you saw with the RRF was that it led to quite a strong administrative or excessive administrative burden. But at the same time, if you look at the criticisms from the Court of Auditors, it was not nearly excessive enough in a way. It was not nearly detailed enough. And what you saw was that it was not in many cases, not all, not necessarily effective, because it led to sort of a tick the box kind of exercise where you just count the number of students that you reach out to rather than thinking about the effect. So there needs to be sort of a balance. And by the way, we know from international literature on conditionality in development aid that this kind of output steering is not conducive to ownership and effectiveness. So there needs to be kind of a balance between local ownership, local projects being linked to national level and EU level transitions, some form of ex ante control to satisfy auditors, but at the same time, sort of an openness that you cannot put politics and the social reality into an ex ante contract. That balance, you see it in this struggle, you see it in the new performance regulation and national regional partnership plans, where they try to sort of mix the local level with the national level, ex ante elements with ex post elements. And I think they've learned, the European Commission has learned from the lessons from the cohesion policy funds. They've learned the lessons from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, as we mentioned. So we still believe it's still too much steering on output indicators, the big annex that Serafin has listed, and insufficiently steers on sort of local, locally formulated implementation logics. But I believe it's already a big step ahead. Don't know if this answers your question, but this is sort of this is
definitely,
what I see.
Definitely provides guidance to how will the ADA situation be like. I'm aware of time, and I think unfortunately we need to stop the picky questions here. And please have a look at the chat, because there was also another question in case you can answer it directly. And I'll pass the mic back to Merve.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria, and also thank you to all the speakers and to the participants today, especially David, Serafin, and Carlos for your contributions to this event. So I will quickly share my screen to close off this webinar. So just for you to know, this was the last and the 9th KTA webinar that we have been organizing in the framework of the Granular Knowledge Transfer Accelerator. But so before we close, I would just like to reflect on what we've achieved and on all the events and the activities that we've done. So over the past years, since 2023, we've explored a wide range of topics in these KTAs, ranging from the Living Labs experiences, rural data, climate neutrality, also looking at the rural proofing. We had a lot of webinars, but also we also organized a few events in person at the European Week of Regions and Cities as part of these KTAs. And the goal with each of the sessions that we've organized was to better understand rural diversity and also to support more effective rural development by making the data more granular, more place-based, and to be more accessible and useful for decision makers. So we will be sharing a link in the chat so you can check all the events that we've organized so far. And for all of them, you will have access to the recordings, the highlights report of the events, as well as all the presentations that were shared with all the speakers that have taken part in these events. And of course, we will also be sharing the outputs from the two events that took place today. So the first one on the Beyond GDP and this one on the performance indicators. But of course, that's not the end of what we've been doing in the KTA. We also have the KTA community, which will remain open. And the granular community is in partnership with the Rural Pack Community Group on innovating rural public policy. So we really encourage you to stay connected and to continue the discussion there on these really important topics. And finally, we also wanted to highlight and mention that we have the final conference of Granular, which is coming up. So we wanted you to save the date. So the conference will be organized on the 24th and 25th of June here in Brussels at the Fondation Universitaire, which is a good venue in Brussels, which is well connected. And so we really invite you to save the date and register once we open the registrations in the coming weeks. And also the conference is going to be organized with our sister project, Rustic, whose work is also in complementary to the work that we're doing in Granular. So please save the date, mark your calendars, and you'll be informed with the newsletter once the registration is open. Thank you very much.